All right. Well, we are so excited to both welcome you all to the Aging, Metabolism, and Emotions Center seminar and our monthly seminar. And we have been waiting for this moment to host Dr. Alison Holman. She is our colleague from UC Irvine. She's a professor of psychological science from the School of Ecology. She got her PhD in health psychology, so she is a kindred spirit, and as well as a BS and a nurse practitioner degree in nursing. She is also the Associate Dean for Academic Personnel, the Principal Investigator for the UC Irvine HBC Summer Research Program, and she is a professor in the newly to be launched soon UC Climate Resilience class that we're so happy she's part of. So she also won the International Society for Traumatic Stresses Studies Ochberg Award for Media and Trauma Study. And Alison is an incredibly unique researcher. She has been very programmatic and has been focusing on understanding exposure to trauma, how it gets under the skin to create both mental health as well as physical health problems, and really focusing on exposure both from proximity, being distance from disasters, to different types of media and looking at graphic media. Her studies are published in the top journals, JAMA, PNAS. They're very high impact. She studied the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Boston Marathon bomber, the Orlando nightclub, hurricanes, all three of the big ones back east, and recently COVID pandemic and trauma. So we are going to get to hear about communal trauma, cascading traumas, and compassion. And I'll just share a quote from her from a recent article that how gratifying it is for her to share her work with policymakers, but also with students. Learning ways to work with people in underserved areas, you learn how to talk to people, to show respect and understanding, and that takes a true compassionate stance. And so I'm glad you're going to be talking about compassion today too. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to come and share my program of research with you. I want to start today. Let me pull up my screen. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to share with you my program of research. I wanted to start by, not good. I wanted to start by sharing with you a little bit about my career because it informs a lot about the program of research I've been involved in. So when I first started my own career, I was a pediatric intensive care unit nurse at Children's Hospital in Oakland, where I witnessed many children and their families torn apart by major illness, injury, accident, and violence. I didn't understand how people coped with such pain. I wanted to help them in any way I could. I was told by my colleagues that I approached my patients and their families like I was a psych nurse, because at report, I would mention the emotional needs of the kids and their families, in addition to their physical care needs. I watched as my nursing colleagues displayed a variety of coping skills as they tried to deal with the pain and sadness of what we were all witnessing. Some built defenses, like by going out to drink after work. Others prayed, and still others used demeaning language and with and about their patients. So for me, none of these strategies felt right. I wanted us to care for both the mental and the physical health needs of our patients and their families, a fact which led the chaplain of the hospital to say to me, "Alison, you need to get your PhD in health psychology." At the time, I had no clue what health psychology was. This was 1983. So I had no clue. And I looked into it, and I ultimately went back to school and got my PhD in health psychology and began studying how people cope with major life trauma, with one of my goals being to eventually train the next generation of nurses to be compassionate caregivers for those and to understand how to address patients in a more holistic way and to become compassionate caregivers, attending to the mental, the physical, and the spiritual needs of their patients. So for more than 30 years, I've been studying how people cope with individual and collective trauma, and the impact this trauma has on both mental and physical health, and the interdependence of mental and physical health. For the last 17 years, I have also been training budding nurses about the importance of providing compassionate care by identifying and addressing their patients' mental health needs. If they want to be the most effective in promoting their patients' health, I tell them that they have to remember psych is 90% of the game, no matter where you work in nursing. A lot of times people think psych is for psych. Well, psych is for everywhere in any kind of a setting. And I try to emphasize that to my students. So today, I'm going to share with you my program of research and briefly touch on some of the important ways that I translate that work into my classes on compassionate care for underserved populations. So over the several past years, Americans have been dealing with significant political strife, the grief of losing millions in an unrelenting pandemic, growing hate crimes, and more, with young Americans reporting the record high levels of distress. This stress has emerged alongside the proliferation of very powerful social media companies that make access to media coverage of collective stress and trauma instantaneous and ubiquitous. And while social media can have some fun aspects to it and be entertaining in some circumstances, it can also have a very significant downside. For the last couple decades, my colleagues and I have been studying the role that media may play in responses to the collective trauma. We have studied 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombings, the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, and hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Michael. I initially got into this work because I was interested in understanding at the gym. I would go to the gym and I would see at the gym, as I was working out, I would see these images of collective trauma shown over and over in a repeat cycle endlessly. And it made me wonder, like, it's very different from a direct exposure to any kind of trauma. It's like in a direct exposure, the event happens, and the event itself, like in a bombing, the bombing happens, and yes, there's an aftermath, but there's no more bombing. But here, in the case of media, what you see is the most intense moments are being repeated over and over, because it's eye-popping, it pulls in viewers, it's good for the bottom line, and it can create a problem. And I kept wondering, like, what is that doing to our brains? And there wasn't a study done and in which they showed traumatic images to people who were in an fMRI machine. And what they found was that when the people saw the specifically traumatic images, and these images were images of a very serious car accident and open eye surgery. I'm not sure that I don't know. I guess that would be very traumatic for some. And people, when they saw those images, parts of the brain that are associated with the development of PTSD light up. So they have seen that even seeing things through film can help highlight the parts of the brain associated with PTSD. So I wanted to study this. I wanted to understand what's going on, what happens when we see this media. So the data I'll be sharing with you today come from a series of prospective longitudinal studies my colleagues and I have conducted since the 9/11 attacks. We use survey research companies who have probability-based representative panels of tens of thousands of Americans. Our samples are randomly selected from these panels. When they're recruited onto the panel, our panelists also provide data on their mental and physical health, so all of our respondents have real pre-event health data available to us, which is very important because it's important to know the pre-event mental health of somebody if you're trying to assess their mental health status down the road. Similarly, the same holds true for mental health, for physical health. When a collective trauma occurs, what we do is, you see, the collective trauma will hit, and we are quick into the field. We usually try to get into the field within the first week or two, if we can. And then we typically follow people between 1 and 6 months after the event, depending on the event. And then we have annual follow-ups across 3 years. Most of them have gone across 3 years. Our COVID study's going across, I don't even know how many, 5, 6, I'm not sure. Can't keep track. Anyway, so that's the basic approach we use in our research. In these studies, our samples include several thousand people, and all available wave 1 respondents are typically brought into our subsequent waves. And we're able to maintain 70 to 75% completion rates over time, meaning 70 to 75% of our initial sample continues in our study over time. To address issues of attrition and loss of non-response, we weight the samples and to make sure that we have representative data to share. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we do have pre-event MD diagnosed mental and physical health problems assessed by the panel, by the survey research company as they join the panel. And they use modified NHIS questions for those, for that survey, part of the survey. So the first study I want to share with you is to discuss is was conducted right after the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013. Following the bombings, we surveyed 4,675 respondents across the country to look at the link between media exposure and acute stress symptoms in the immediate aftermath. We found a linear association between acute stress and media exposure. So as media exposure increases, you can see as media exposure increases, levels of acute stress symptoms also increase. And this finding, importantly, this finding is the same when we take people with pre-existing mental health problems out of our analysis. So this isn't just an artifact of mental health, pre-existing mental health problems. Importantly, what made these findings stand out was the strength of the association between media exposure and acute stress, which dwarfed that of direct exposure. So here's the highest level of media exposure, and here's direct exposure. So it's very clear that watching many hours of media coverage in the week following the bombings was a stronger predictor of acute stress symptoms than was being at the scene of the bombing. And this analysis also, just by the way, it controlled for the pre-existing mental health challenges. We always control for that. So this led us to ask, what is it about the media exposure that renders people more vulnerable to acute stress? Given the media's predilection for using eye-popping imagery that I mentioned, brought me into this line of inquiry. But given their tendency to use those kinds of images to bring people onto their sites, we thought that maybe the likelihood of seeing disturbing or graphic images in the media would be high among people who were highest in acute stress. And we hypothesized that people who frequently saw graphic images would be more likely to report higher levels of acute stress. For clarity, just so whenever I talk about the term graphic here, what I'm referring to is images of bloodied victims or seeing bodies of dead people, those kinds of things that are can be very gruesome. So indeed, what we found was that frequent exposure to bloody images was associated with higher acute stress 6 months, and 6 months later was associated with more worry about future terrorism. We also found small but significant indirect effects with worry about future terrorism and with global functioning later. These are small, I recognize that, but they were significant. And the fact that they're controlling for the amount of media exposure is particularly noticeable. I want to highlight here too that the amount of hours that a person engaged in media, watching media or engaging with media, was also associated with worry and indirectly associated with our global functioning measure later on as well. And when we break it down even more, we find that bloody images have a stronger association with subsequent worry about future terrorism than does direct exposure, as you can see here, direct exposure to and the amount of how much television media engagement they had, how much non-traditional media. When we say non-traditional, we're referring to like social media. So all of these things had lower, less strong associations with the fear of future terrorism. And fear of future terrorism is basically worrying, and it's a very important concept when you think about not just mental health, but physical health as well. So using 3 years of follow-up data from the Boston Marathon bombing study, that included reassessment of cardiac ailments after the bombings, I extended these findings by examining whether media exposure contributes to subsequent cardiovascular ailments, like new ones, through its association with acute stress, because I had previously shown in our 9/11 study that the amount of acute stress people reported in the 9 to 23 days following the 9/11 attacks was associated with new onset cardiovascular ailments at 1, 2, and 3 years following the 9/11 attacks. I wanted to try to see, can I replicate that? Because it is just a correlational finding. And indeed, we did replicate it. The amount of media exposure that people were engaged with, what we saw was indeed the amount of media exposure was indirectly associated with new cardiac ailments, subsequent fears about the future, and functioning through acute stress. And importantly, greater exposure to bloody images from the bombings was associated with acute stress. And through that connection, it had a small but significant association with new onset cardiac ailments, worry about the future, and even functional impairment after the Pulse nightclub shooting, which was 3 years later. So thus far, what I've showed is that extensive media exposure to collective traumas is associated with higher distress and may even be linked to physical ailments after collective stress or trauma. But it may also be the case that consumption of media coverage of collective traumas is a normative response by which distressed individuals try to reduce their anxiety about an event by reducing their disaster-related uncertainty through information-seeking behaviors. So they go to the media to get information that they need to help reduce their anxiety. This is known as the uncertainty management hypothesis. And individuals who are concerned about an event may gather information about it through the media as a strategy to reduce the discomfort they're feeling. However, because our data make it clear that media exposure is associated with more distress rather than less, it may be that trying to reduce your anxiety by seeking information in the media backfires as a coping strategy and results in an escalating cycle of distress. To test this hypothesis, we followed the respondents from our Boston Marathon bombing study for 3 years. And with our final survey was, as I mentioned, our final survey was conducted after the Pulse nightclub shooting. Using data that we had collected over this 3-year period, we tested this hypothesis to see if media use, the media use distress connection becomes cyclical or cumulative over time. And it appears that it can. Here we see that the Boston Marathon bombing media exposure was associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms, which was associated with subsequent worry about the future, which was associated with Pulse nightclub shooting, with Pulse nightclub media exposure and higher distress a year later. Right after the Pulse Club shooting. We also found that exposure to violence that people experienced before the Boston Marathon bombings indirectly predicted Pulse nightclub shooting related acute stress through this whole series of connections over time. So if extensive media exposure to collective trauma is linked to higher distress and more worry about the future, which may encourage more media exposure and more distress over time, that kind of leads you to ask the question, why are people engaging with this apparently distressing media? Like, is it something about the respondents? Is it the nature of the media itself? For example, does sharing an identity with the victim make people more likely to engage with media coverage of an event? That is shared identity with mental health, is shared identity associated with mental health outcomes as well? To address this, we examined data after the Pulse nightclub shootings. And what I need to caveat for a second and note that the Pulse nightclub shootings, the night that happened was Gay Latino night. So the people who were there, the club was packed with gay folks from the Latino community. And what we see here in this study is we see that those who shared one demographic identity with the victims, so if they were either LGBTQ or they were Hispanic, not necessarily both, when they were both, we didn't have the power to test that really. But we see that those who shared that one demographic identity with them was associated with more media coverage. We also saw that it was associated with more distress following the attack, the shooting. So now, although media exposure is linked with distress and may contribute to a cycle of distress following media coverage, following collective trauma, there may be a positive role for media during and after collective trauma. For example, in other words, it may be a double-edged sword. For example, during periods of high ambiguity and uncertainty, people seek trusted information via the media, and they can provide critical guidance that will help people make risk assessments, help people seek information about how to protect themselves. However, the media also is full of rumors and misinformation that appear on social media, which is not vetted for accuracy. And perceptions of risk and anxiety rise when information is ineffectively communicated, or people are exposed to conflicting information, misinformation, and disinformation. So this begs the question, what positive role could media have if we're talking about coping in the context of a collective trauma? That is, if media is a double-edged sword, what is the beneficial side of media exposure following collective trauma? Perhaps it could educate the public about the risks they face. So to learn more about that, we studied responses to hurricanes in Florida. And what we see, you may recall in 2017, Hurricane Irma hit Florida as a Category 4 storm after devastating parts of the Caribbean as a Category 5 storm. Anticipation of the storm was widespread in the news, and attempts were made to alert the public about the severity of the storm. 54 out of 67 counties in Florida issued evacuations orders. And this is what we were seeing in the news. These are the images that we were seeing in the news. And you can see essentially almost the entire state of Florida is being told to evacuate, which, has issues. There are problems with that, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we conducted a study, an innovative study, by going into the field before the hurricane hit. So this way, we were able to assess residents' anticipated post-traumatic stress, the symptoms, their media usage, and their evacuation plans. We followed up 1 month later to assess how people were doing in the aftermath. And then 1 year later, Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle in Florida, and we went back out into the field and surveyed the respondents again to see how they were doing after Hurricane Michael made landfall. In our first paper from this study, we showed that in the broader context of anticipating an approaching disaster, forecasted PTS symptoms, post-traumatic stress symptoms, were associated with the 1 month later, the wave 2 negative mental health outcomes. And that association was in part mediated through their exposure to or how much Irma-related media exposure they had. And that the media exposure was contributing to that, showing that the media exposure was contributing to people's distress over time. In this figure, I just want to point out the blue boxes here represent the data that was collected before Irma made landfall. The yellow represent data that was collected 1 month later, and the green represents what we saw in after Hurricane Michael. So here we show that direct, indirect, and media-based exposures to both Hurricane Irma and Michael were positively associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms after Hurricane Michael, a year later. We also show that these repeated direct, indirect, and media exposures to hurricanes, Michael and Irma and Michael, were positively associated with functional impairment as well, following Hurricane Michael. What we saw then during these 2 catastrophic hurricanes is that media communications, which are supposed to be helping to inform people about what to do, actually, the communications about the storms were confusing. They were or sensationalized. The risks that people faced, many people, the majority of the state was told to evacuate, all of which leads to many evacuating unnecessarily, clogging roads, making evacuation for those who needed to evacuate more difficult. And in so doing, the media may have actually produced more distress, as we have seen here, and difficulty functioning in the aftermath instead of helping people cope. So what about educating the public about the potential risks? What about educating the public? So we've done a study ongoing in Lake County, California. I want to back up. A county in which 60% of the land burned over a 4-year period, leaving a very charred landscape, much like what you see here. So Lake County, California has one of the worst health records of California counties. It's down in I think it's like, I don't remember exactly how many counties, but it was like, if there were 49 counties, it was 48. And they have tended to have high levels of suicidality, suicidal thinking, attempted suicides, as well as completed suicides and chronic diseases of a variety of sorts. They also experienced 7 serious fires in 4 years. Between 2015 and 2018, 60% of their land burned. And so emergency managers, county emergency managers, really want to know, like, how well informed are the residents about their risks? Do they understand what risks they face? And so we, in the early summer of 2023, we started another study surveying 814 residents using address-based probability sampling, and plan to follow up with them next winter. In this first assessment, we looked at their risk perceptions for a variety of potential disasters. We also looked at their worries, what things they were worried about, because you may remember worry was an important link that connected the media with some of the mental health and physical health outcomes. So given the previous wildfires and the recent couple years of intense rain, one of the factors that's really important for the residents to understand is that they're at high risk for mudslides, landslides, and flooding. In fact, the engineers we're working with have identified a high-risk landslide in Lake County that sits right above a town. And with a heavy rainfall year, that could potentially trigger a landslide that just goes down and devastates the town. Yet, if we look at what the residents are worried about, we see that a large majority of the residents do not consider landslides a serious risk. That you can see in the green. The green is not at all. So they don't see that as a serious thing to worry about. Similarly, they have much less concern about flooding, something that has been widespread across California in recent years. So the two things that the emergency managers want them to be thinking about, they're not really worried about that. They're not paying as close attention. However, they are quite concerned about extreme heat and wildfires, and that's kind of like a no-brainer. Of course, they're going to be worried about that, given that they've, 60% of the land burned. But the other, paying attention to what the subsequent consequences are of that burn area and what risks they pose to the residents is very important. So these data suggest that there's a need to educate county residents about the downstream risks associated with heavy wildfire damage, like flooding, mudslide, and landslides. And this is an important and essential role that the media could play if they wanted to support public health. Another potential positive role for the media would be for it to promote pro-social positive behaviors. For example, they could promote pro-social behavior that facilitates recovery options for disaster victims. We wanted to understand this as well, so we examined it by asking whether media exposure is associated with pro-social behavior. We addressed this using data from a study we started early in the beginning of the pandemic using our probability-based representative sample. And between spring of 2020 and spring of 2022, we collected 4 waves of data. And our 4th wave of data was collected just shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine in late February of 2022. So at the start of the war, there was a lot of speculation about the possibility of it leading to a nuclear war, as the NATO powers were working very hard to offer Ukraine support and supplies, military supplies. So to make our survey in our Wave 4 survey fit and match what we were seeing in the news, our spring 2022 survey asked several questions about respondents' identification with the Ukrainian people and asked them to report how much they were engaging in any pro-social behaviors in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So things like donating money to support the victims, posting support for Ukraine, and any other acts to show their support for the Ukrainian people. So here what we see is that the extent to which people identified with the Ukrainian war victims was associated with more exposure to both graphic here and non-graphic images about the war, and with a 27% increased incidence of engaging in pro-social behaviors toward the Ukrainians. But what role did media play in this? Well, what we see is that while seeing graphic imagery from the war was not associated with pro-social behaviors towards Ukrainians, it was associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms. However, non-graphic imagery from the war was associated with a 16% increased incidence of engaging in pro-social behaviors. So perhaps the silver lining of media exposure is that if it isn't too graphic, it may motivate people to engage in pro-social behaviors, to essentially show compassion for victims of war. And with all of these findings in mind, I'm going to circle back now to my work as a nurse. And I'm doing this because I see engaging in pro-social behavior as an act of compassion, one of the most important cornerstones of my profession as a nurse. And these findings suggest to me that there may be a role for media in promoting compassionate pro-social behaviors. However, the challenge we face when coping with both individual and collective trauma is that societal norms, values, attitudes often limit the public expressions of compassion for trauma victims. This may be another area where media could play a positive role. To understand what good can come from media, we need to understand the sociocultural context that shapes traumatic experiences and our responses to them here in the US, and also in other parts of the world, but especially here. Deep-seated cultural mores canonized by Horatio Alger's stories of poor boys becoming self-made men and have a profound impact on our social mores regarding the experience of and response to trauma. The message of his stories promoted a deeply individualistic narrative about what we should expect from people who are coping with adversity. They're supposed to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. The problem with this approach is that it situates the trauma in the individual without considering the broader societal contexts in which the trauma occurs. In so doing, this attitude marginalizes victims, often leads to them feeling isolated and alone, and it also fails to take into account the fact that not everyone has boots. This narrative is one of the core themes that has shaped how we interpret people's behavior as they cope with trauma. For example, we often blame the victims when they don't recover quickly. We expect people to get over the experience within a relatively short period of time, to move on. And if they don't, we pathologize their response instead of thinking it is a, quote, normal response to a profoundly abnormal experience. But psychological research offers us an alternative way to frame what it means to cope with trauma, and it offers a new path for approaching each other and our patients with compassion. It starts with the core understanding that human beings have a fundamental need to belong. As Baumeister and Leary wrote in 1995, human beings are fundamentally and pervasively motivated by a need to belong. That is, by a strong desire to form and maintain enduring interpersonal attachments. People seek frequent, affectively positive interactions within the context of long-term caring relationships. Experiencing major adversity, especially when it is caused by human behavior, can leave people feeling alone, disconnected, afraid to trust, and sometimes on the margins of society. And this is why prosocial behaviors, acts of compassion, are so necessary for healing from trauma. Prosocial compassionate action is the glue that connects and reconnects us, that fulfills that need to belong. So acts of compassion also promote healing through strengthened social bonds that help us connect to support systems, resources, and ultimately our own humanity. And as you guys know very well, compassion is also associated with staying healthy. It's health protective. People are happier, their blood pressure's lower, there are many other health benefits of engaging in compassionate acts. And it's contagious. So we sense it in each other. And when we do detect it in each other, it makes us more likely to act in altruistic ways towards others, which can trigger what's called a butterfly effect. So one person acts in a compassionate way, does an act of kindness to one other person, that person does it to another person. Now you've got all these people doing it to each other. And ultimately what you have is an ability to affect an entire community. In healthcare settings, and I bring it back to being this because I'm a nurse, in healthcare settings, research on compassion further shows that compassionate action by healthcare professionals is not only beneficial for their patients, but it actually can benefit the providers as it builds deeper human connections for us, and it reinforces our purpose and meaning in the work we do. So, drawing from our research findings and the work that that's been done on compassion, we need to consider recommendations we can make to improve media's approach to reporting on collective trauma. I previously referred to the media as a double-edged sword. We have shown in several studies that we've shown the downside of media exposure to collective trauma, but perhaps we can find that silver lining of this exposure by identifying ways that media can be used as a tool to promote more pro-social behavior, more acts of compassion when disaster hits. For example, media could avoid sensationalizing traumatic events, focus on the victims and their needs. So they bring out what the victims need and what the victims need and want and how to help them. We can destigmatize normal responses to abnormal situations instead of encouraging the typical responses that are inbred in our cultural mores. We can motivate people who identify with the victims to engage in pro-social and compassionate behaviors, or maybe highlight the pro-social behaviors that people are already doing, because people naturally engage in these actions in the aftermath of events. And we can encourage the media, and we try to do this, to use their images from collective traumas very judiciously. So we saw that the graphic images are associated with greater post-traumatic stress symptoms, but the non-graphic ones are associated with engaging in some pro-social behaviors. So being thoughtful about how they use their images is one thing they can do. Media can also educate their public about their risks in a calm and straightforward way. We've done research. We did some research after the big Ebola scare in the 2014. And we showed that when people are given information about their risks, they understand it and they act appropriately. Not when it's hyped, but when they're given calmly given information that reflects what is the facts about the situation. The media can also encourage people to understand what are the best approaches to prepare for the climate-related hazards that they face, and help them look at specific ways that they can help disaster victims. So they can give them a menu of ways to help disaster victims. And one thing that I think is really important is they can also help people learn how to identify a scam during disaster efforts, because I don't know if you've heard about this, but after disasters, there are often scammers online who say they're taking money to help the victims, but in fact they're not. And it's very important to recognize this before people end up being hurt. Media can also help build platforms on social media to support disaster victims. Social media can be problematic, but it doesn't have to be if it's regulated and if it's supported to provide, say, a 24/7 disaster resource referral hub, something like that, encourage people to engage in the pro-social behaviors. They could also tell stories about people helping others. We occasionally see that in the media, but not all that often in the mainstream media. And then obviously social media already does this. It helps us stay connected with loved ones. What about policymakers? So what can policymakers do? Well, I'm a big fan of regulating media and big tech to hold them accountable for how they spread misinformation and disinformation, which confuses people in the aftermath of major disasters. And stopping the spread of graphic violence online. I don't know if you guys remember that back in, I don't remember what year it was, 2018, 2019, in New Zealand, in Christchurch, the man who live streamed him killing people in a mosque, many people. And that video was live streamed and it got all over the web, and people were watching this horrific event and just watching it happen as it was happening. And that kind of thing there needs to be some way to stop the media companies from letting that stuff go unchecked. We can also allocate more money for research. I know everybody always says, give us more money for research, but the mechanism underlying the link between media exposure and health are still not 100% clear. Our work is all correlational studies, prospective longitudinal correlational studies, but it's very important. It'd be good to have some experimental studies as well, and more population-based studies to do natural experiments. The positive role media can play in responding to collective trauma also could be something that we could look at in more research. People could take time to try to identify that. And then the final one here that I want to emphasize is something that I feel it's commonly done in Scandinavian countries. They educate young people about how to recognize misinformation and disinformation on the web, but we don't do that here. We don't have that kind of education, but we really need it so that our people will know how to know when the information they're getting is actually real information, good factual information. Healthcare providers, what can we do? Well, healthcare providers, we can provide, tell our patients, don't engage with extensive media exposure after collective stress or trauma. We can create apps. Lots of healthcare providers are creating apps now to help people relax, get better sleep, but we could also do something to help people that they can turn to in the immediate aftermath of a collective event that helps guide them to where they should, what they can do to support themselves, to take care of themselves. And we can also educate our patients about the benefits they could get from engaging in pro-social, compassionate pro-social behaviors in their communities. What can individuals do? We can limit our repetitious exposure to media stories. We have to take charge over ourselves. I think there needs to be broader consequences, as I just mentioned, but I think individuals also need to take responsibility and try to select a couple of authoritative outlets that you trust. They have shown themselves to be accurate sources of information, and limit the amount of exposure you have to it. So I often recommend, if you need 20 minutes or 30 minutes in the morning, and then don't engage with the media for the day, and then maybe do that again at the end of the day if you need an update. I don't encourage people to avoid media altogether, because I think it's very important to have informed citizens. However, I don't encourage people to get stuck doom scrolling. We can also stop and think before we respond on social media. This is really important, because oftentimes we like something or we share something like out of an immediate emotional, like, ooh, that's intense, I'm going to share that. It's better to stop and think, well, gosh, if I share this with my group, what am I doing here? We can fact check before you share it with each other. So you can actually go and see, is this actually a true story? And of course, avoid graphic images, and certainly don't share the graphic images with others. Individuals can also remember that anxiety is contagious, but so is compassion. So if we act in compassionate ways, it actually may help us reduce anxiety. It may help us feel better in the aftermath of an event, and it will connect us with other people who are engaged, who are coping as well. And so if we act on our empathy, that is, if we show compassion, we may promote resilience in ourselves and in others. And the final thing I want to suggest for individuals is that we need to pay attention to our bodies as we consume media, because in our bodies, it's really hard we have to pay attention to the heartbeat and all breathing to see if we're having trouble, if the media is doing something to us. So there's some future research, and I just noticed that it's almost 1 o'clock, and I see Alyssa here. So I can just share this, show you there's lots of future research that can be done, and I'll thank my collaborators. Thank you. I'm sorry it took so long. I didn't realize that this was.
It was fantastic. It's such a full and rich line of work, and we wanted to hear all of it. So thank you.
Yeah.
So we do have time for questions. I see Ryan Brown is first.
I was just going to say thank you for showing us this line of work. It's something I'm less familiar with, but I was in Houston around Hurricane Harvey, so the impact on the communities from these events and sort of that I think what you're tapping into with the anticipation of the future and what information is really needed versus what like what is actually motivating the action. So I just wanted to say thank you on that. And I guess if you can speak to, I think what you were really getting towards is the what motivates the pro-social behavior piece. And so I think that I'm wondering if you see that being the main purpose that media should be serving around this around these really catastrophic kinds of events.
I do see that as a very, very important role for the media to play in the aftermath of these events. Obviously, it does need to be informing people, giving people the information they need to know where to go, how to protect themselves, stay safe. But encouraging people to do that in groups, encouraging people to connect with other people in the community, even that alone is pro-social to me, because it encourages the creation of community bonds in addressing what's going on. And I think that is certainly a major area for media to play a positive role. And unfortunately, as we showed, it's so far we've seen a little bit of it, but not a lot. Did I
Thank you.
address your question okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to comment, Allison, I've never seen you present all of this work before, and it really is kind of both kind of an incredible portfolio of a program, but it strikes me as like so incredibly meaningful. And I think for the people on the call to kind of it's clear that you have such an invested interest in this work, and I think it really shows how people can have such a fulfilling career when the work that they're doing is so important. And so I just wanted to make that comment.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that, Eric. And yeah, I mean, for me, as I mentioned, it's about what I learned as a nurse and taking that to the next step. And I think it is possible. It's, I'm a firm believer in passion in your work, really having your heart in your work. And I tell my grad students, if your heart isn't in it, that's not what you should do. You got to do something else. You got to find something that you got your heart in, because it really does matter. So, but thank you. And I'd say that to any of the grad students or postdocs that are in the room now, really following your passion, your genius. My husband and I talk about this a lot. Your genius is where your passion and your talent intersect. And that's where it's a really great place to seek out. So
That is such beautiful advice to end on. And as Eric said, your work is, of the highest significance right now. It's such an amazing basic to applied policy line of work. And we're so grateful to you. And we also look forward to working with you more on climate trauma and climate resilience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I really thank you for giving me an opportunity to come speak to you. I really appreciate that.